Welcome to American Ambition, a history podcast about plans, hopes, and visions for the future of the United States. This is episode 5, Fugitives in Kansas, the fifth episode in a series tracking the 19th century political crisis that led to the American Civil War in 1861. Beginning with this episode, our timeline will slow considerably as the building tensions of the mid-19th century United States get worse and worse. In previous episodes, we covered 10 years or more at a time, but now we're going to slow down to about 5 years apiece for this episode and episode 6, where we talk about the 1850s, and then we'll eventually cover about 18 months between 1860 and 1861 in our 7th and final episode in this series. You may recall from last episode that following the Mexican War, Congress argued for about 2 years about what to do with all the land they had conquered, a process that resulted in the initially popular and then quickly very controversial Compromise of 1850. We'll be covering the fallout from the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of that compromise, as well as a new law which will make just about everything worse, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We'll close by discussing some of the new political parties that arise out of this chaotic decade, the Republicans and the American, or Know-Nothing, Party. But before we get into all of that, I want to take a step back for a moment, because there's something I've been looking for an opportunity to talk about, and I think that by discussing it now, this episode will make more sense. I want to touch base on a question that I think is a pretty common one to ask when studying this period. Why would white Americans from the northern states go to war over slavery? We've talked a bit about Northerners who cared deeply about slavery and opposed it, and also about how some of those people came at this issue from very different perspectives. Many Christian abolitionists saw slavery as a moral evil, an inhuman stain that needed to be eradicated from the United States. They hoped to abolish slavery everywhere. More recently, anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats had come to believe that the expansion of slaveholding posed a threat to the future prosperity of the country and the economic prospects of common white men. They, especially the anti-slavery Democrats, primarily hoped to stop slavery from spreading, to preserve the Western territories for, as David Wilmot had put it, quote, the sons of toil of my own race. In 1840, some abolitionists had begun running redeemed slaveholder James Birney for president, but received only 7,000 votes. 8 years later, pragmatic abolitionists joined with anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats to run Martin Van Buren under the banner of the Free Soil Party, and they received 290,000 votes, but still nothing in the Electoral College. By the mid-1850s, a new anti-slavery party, the Republicans, had arisen, and in 1856, Republican John Fremont won more than 4 times as many votes as Van Buren, and for the first time, an anti-slavery party would receive votes in the Electoral College. So this rapid ascendancy in the popularity of the anti-slavery political parties demands an explanation, I think. And to explain this, we need to explain why Northern whites who had so far been content to let slavery be changed their minds. This isn't to say that they necessarily liked or supported slavery, just that it was not a politically salient issue to them. This described most white Northerners in 1849. Many viewed slavery as other states' problem. Almost all shared severe racial prejudice against Black Americans and did not see them as in any way equal to whites or deserving of the same freedoms. Some saw those who did agitate about slavery as dangerous radicals. But something changed their minds. First, I want to give due credit to the abolitionists. These were people like Frederick Douglass, who published the abolitionist newspaper North Star in Rochester, Theodore Weld and Angelina Grimke, whose 1839 book-length expose, American Slavery as It Is, described the cruel torment of slavery in enslavers' own words. And the legions of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were foot soldiers and evangelists of the abolitionist cause in local anti-slavery societies across the northern states. By offering reasoned, researched, impassioned critiques of slavery, they offered somewhere to turn for those who developed increasing doubts about the slave system. But what pushed Northerners to harbor these doubts in the first place Well, this brings us to the slave power conspiracy. The slave power conspiracy was an idea that originated with anti-slavery and abolitionist activists, but gained increasing mainstream traction in the North, especially in the years following the Wilmot Proviso debates. The slave power conspiracy was the idea that a small clique of wealthy Southern enslavers dominated their own states and had leveraged that dominance into disproportionate power in the American federal government, that they were using this power to protect and expand slavery at the expense of the free states and against the will of the majority of Americans. These slaveholders exploited quirks of the constitutional system, such as the Three-Fifths Clause, to exaggerate their political influence far beyond their relatively small numbers. By using the government for their own gain and against the wishes of most of the people, they exposed themselves as an anti-majoritarian faction and a danger to the Republic. You'll notice there's nothing in what I just said about the evil of slaveholding. This is about the fear that the Republic was being usurped by a faction of slaveholders and the threat that they posed to the Union. Why was this notion of a slave power conspiracy convincing? Well, it was easy to construct a narrative of Southern dominance of the federal government and how that dominance had translated into benefits for the slaveholding class. We can run through a couple right now. Beginning in 1800, Thomas Jefferson had ousted John Adams, one of the only Northern presidents, in a close election in which the Three-Fifths Compromise proved the crucial difference. Since then, with the help of that Three-Fifths Compromise, Southern slaveholders had dominated the presidential office. Southern slaveholders like Jackson and his disciple Polk had used their control of that office to gain vast new Southern lands for the expansion of slavery. Jackson's expulsion of the Indians of the American Southeast and the Trail of Tears, and Polk's war with Mexico were essential to securing the slave states of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. When Northerners had used their constitutional right to speak out against slavery and to encourage Congress to use its power to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, well, rather than listen to them, Southern lawmakers imposed the congressional gag rule, barring anti-slavery petitions from being considered in Congress. And now, in the 1850s, we'll add to this list, because the slavers, this argument soon went, were no longer content with slavery in the South. Now they had to make Northerners into slave catchers, too. The slave power conspiracy emerged as an explanation for why this relatively small population of the richest Southern enslavers managed to routinely secure favorable government policies. Northerners and Southerners could both read the census reports and see for themselves that Northern states were growing much larger than Southern ones. But while the disciples of the recently deceased John C. Calhoun argued that Southern states therefore needed more guarantees that their slave property would be safe, the slave power conspiracy offered an appealing and, well, conspiratorial explanation of why Northern population advantage had not transferred into political advantage. As federal policy continued to favor slaveholders' interests, this explanation would grow more and more popular. And with that, after nearly 1,000 words, we can pick up our narrative where we left it off last week, with the Compromise of 1850 and its most controversial provision, the new expanded Fugitive Slave Act. The Compromise of 1850, you will recall, was dreamed up and passed by Whig Henry Clay and Democrat Stephen Douglas as a way to put a lid on the chaos that the Mexican War had unleashed. Tensions were rising because people like David Wilmot were going around saying that slavery shouldn't be allowed in any new southwestern states, and pro-slavery radical fire eaters like Robert Toombs responded that he'd rather blow up the Union than consent to that. Clay, with Douglas's help, was trying to calm things down. And at first, the compromise was really popular. Many white Americans were genuinely worried and uncomfortable about the direction politics had taken in the last couple years, and even if there were things they didn't like about the compromise, they were happy to have a new settlement so they could all move on. This honeymoon period didn't last long, however, because pretty soon Northerners realized that in allowing this Fugitive Slave Act to pass, they had conceded far more than they wished to. So what is this law I'm referring to? Well, you will remember from our first episode that one of the important compromises over slavery in the Constitution was that states would be required to extradite any quote-unquote fugitives from service back to the state that they had fled from. This vague constitutional provision had been given some teeth with the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, which empowered enslavers or their agents to go recapture any people they enslaved who had escaped, and imposed a hefty fine on anyone caught helping fugitives from slavery. Note that this meant enslaved people who escaped to northern states were not legally free according to federal law and were always at the risk of recapture. Frederick Douglass, for instance, only secured his legal freedom in 1846, 8 years after his escape, when some British abolitionists purchased him from his former owner and obviously subsequently emancipated him. Southern enslavers found this law insufficient because bands of activists, be they Ohio evangelicals, free blacks of New York City, Pennsylvania Quakers, they were often able to stymie the efforts of slave catchers, either in the courts or by the use of the clandestine network of safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. As a result, one of the things enslavers had been agitating for was a stronger fugitive slave law. And boy, did they get it. This new 1850 law made 4 major changes to how fugitive slave cases were handled in the United States. First, it created a special class of commissioners to adjudicate these cases, taking them out of the hands of local judges and magistrates. Second, at any hearing before one of these commissions, the alleged enslaved person would not be allowed to testify, and the commissioner would receive twice as large a fee for finding against the alleged fugitive than for them, and there'd be no appeal from this commissioner's decision. Third, a commissioner or other local official could order a citizen to aid in recapturing an alleged fugitive under penalty of imprisonment. And fourth, people who aided alleged fugitives were also subject to imprisonment. Now, this struck many who read the new law, then and now, as a gross miscarriage of justice. For one thing, there's no part of this process where a person who was legally free could make themselves heard if they were accused of being a fugitive from slavery. This law was, as many pointed out at the time, an invitation to legalized kidnapping. It insulted any sense of impartiality by offering a clear cash incentive to find in favor of the enslaver. And much to Northerners' chagrin, they are now threatened with imprisonment if they did not actively uphold the slave system. No longer could Northerners say, slavery is just a Southern thing, it's none of my business. Now, failure to actively aid slave catchers when called upon was a federal crime. Many pointed out that the new law effectively nationalized slavery, that no longer were there free states and slave states, but white Americans everywhere were now required to endorse slavery. Just like when the Slave South banned anti-slavery petitions rather than let them be read, it seemed that Southerners were willing, happy even, to sacrifice the rights and freedoms of white Northerners to protect their own property and slaves. Just like when the Slave South banned anti-slavery petitions rather than let them be read, it seemed that Southerners were willing, happy even, to sacrifice the rights and freedoms of white Northerners to protect their own property and slaves. It is difficult to overstate how much this law offended many white Northerners. Amos Adams Lawrence of Massachusetts explained the transformation it wrought in himself and his neighbors, writing, quote, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists," unquote. Many Northerners understood the Fugitive Slave Act as Southerners sticking their nose in Northerners' business, refusing to let them run their own affairs. Others, even those who might have otherwise accepted the slavery in principle, were offended by what seemed like a naked attempt to twist the justice system in favor of slaveholders. This made converts to the anti-slavery cause. It made the slave power conspiracy seem that much more plausible. I should note that this is an excellent example of the effect that enslaved people could have on electoral politics, despite being shut out from the formal political system. By insisting on escaping, enslaved people proved that enslavers were lying when those enslavers claimed that slavery was a benevolent system and a positive good. If the enslaved people were so well treated after all, why were their enslavers demanding a new, stronger law to help them recapture those that escaped? If the enslaved were so well treated, why was escape such a problem? By fleeing slavery, Black Americans made enslavers appear corrupt and self-serving, which in turn helped convince more and more Northerners that enslavers were dishonest and untrustworthy. This also puts lie to the post-war claims that all the Southern states were ever interested in was states' rights, because clearly slaveholding states were happy to invoke federal power to override states' autonomy when it supported slavery. So, to summarize, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was deeply unpopular in northern states for a number of reasons, but primarily because it, A, felt like Southerners forcing them to do their dirty work, B, seemed like a blatant perversion of the justice system, and C, forced white Northerners to confront the brutal reality of forcing someone into enslavement. This made the idea of a slave power conspiracy, the notion that slaveholders were an illegitimate minority faction that was corrupting the Republic for their own gain, made this idea far more credible. Now, most of what I just described is white Northerners becoming angry at how this new law affected them. But the Fugitive Slave Law also led many Northerners to sympathize with enslaved people, thanks in large part to the work of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe was born in Connecticut to a devoutly religious family. Her father, Lyman, and her brother Henry were both prominent Congregationalist ministers, and Harriet married a theological scholar and moved to Cincinnati. Living on the border of legal slavery, she was one of relatively few New Englanders to be directly exposed to the realities of slavery and those that fled from it. The slave catchers prowling the streets, want ads in the paper for fugitive slaves, and just the importance of the Ohio River as a dividing line between the realm of freedom and the realm of slavery. She had written on anti-slavery topics over the course of her adulthood, but two major events inspired her magnum opus. First, the death of her infant son Samuel caused her immense grief and led her to reflect on, in her words, quote, what a poor slave mother may feel when her child is torn away from her. Second, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act spurred her to take up her pen again to denounce slavery. Stowe wrote a novel on the suffering of the enslaved and the importance of Christian love, and when it appeared in print in 1852 as Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was an instant bestseller. So far as we can tell, the only book that sold better in the 19th century was the Bible. Stowe's novel told the story of multiple characters confronting the evils of slavery and of the good characters abiding Christian faith. Tom, a Christ stand-in, is a noble-hearted enslaved man and Christian convert who suffers and dies at the hands of his enslavers while insisting always that he forgives them. Now, despite the radicalizing effect that her book would have, Stowe did not want to turn the world upside down. In a book aimed primarily at female readers, she stressed the ability of pious women to exert a positive influence from the home by influencing their husbands and sons with moral virtue. Stowe was not one of the activists at Seneca Falls demanding the vote. Rather, she was deliberately trying to maintain a mainstream position, stressing the moral good that educated women could accomplish with their work in the domestic sphere. The stilted, pedantic style of the writing makes the book somewhat difficult to read today, but it was meant to mimic the style of other literature marketed to educated girls and women of the 19th century. Stowe was using the genre of sentimental fiction that had been a vehicle for many myths about the American South to instead spread an anti-slavery message. One of the most important impacts of Uncle Tom's Cabin was the way it worked to dispel myths about slavery that had spread through rosy portrayals of plantation life in other works of sentimental fiction. Slaveholders, for example, were not kind and benevolent masters in Stowe's work, but cruel and capricious, greedy and irreligious. Importantly, Stowe stresses that this behavior and attitude is a product of the slave system, not something inherent about white Southerners. Simon Legree, the big bad of the book, the slaver who buys Tom, attempts to force Tom to abandon his Christian faith and then ultimately kills him. Well, Legree is a Vermonter. The comparison between Legree and Tom is clear. A white Northerner can be a sinner, and an enslaved black man a saint. Stowe also confronted and rejected the idea that the sale of enslaved people was a rare and regrettable occasion for enslavers. Instead, she correctly portrayed the selling of enslaved people as central to the slave system. Tom is sold multiple times in the book, and the prospect of Eliza's child being sold threatens to separate them forever. Stowe's portrayal of the prospect of sale drove home for white readers how frightful and unsettling it would be to be forcibly uprooted from one's family and subjected to the cruel whims of some new master. Stowe also emphasizes the familial bonds between enslaved people. Prejudice against black people in general and enslaved people in particular led many 19th century American whites to believe that black people were less emotionally intelligent, did not feel hurt in the same way that white people did. Many believed that because enslaved people could not legally marry, that their families weren't real. But by emphasizing the fear of separation among enslaved people and the emotional hurt at the prospect of losing a loved one, Stowe forced white Northerners, many probably for the first time, to really think about enslaved people as people. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was far from perfect. Even at the time, people pointed out that the book reinforced a number of negative stereotypes about black Americans. Frederick Douglass also took issue with Stowe's decision to have one of her characters leave for Liberia at the end, an unhelpful reminder that many white Americans still thought that it wasn't such a bad idea to send black Americans back, quote-unquote, to Africa. In short, while Uncle Tom's Cabin's portrayal of slavery is damning and on point, its portrayal of the enslaved, or black people themselves, is often two-dimensional, paternalistic, and still informed by racist ideas and stereotypes. But while the book leaves a lot to be desired as an anti-racist text, as an anti-slavery text, it was remarkably effective at encouraging white Northerners to see slavery as a moral evil, to identify defenses of slavery as self-serving fabrications, and determine that the slave system was an enemy that must be confronted. The Fugitive Slave Act accelerated the American crisis over slavery. On one hand, it lent legitimacy to an argument abolitionists had long been making, that the whole country, including Northerners, were complicit in slavery. On the other hand, Northern outrage and soon resistance to the law then seemed to justify the hardcore pro-slavery Southern fire eaters who argued that Northerners' promises could not be trusted, that they would never treat the slave South with equality. Both abolitionists and fire eaters were viewed by many within their own region as radical troublemakers, until events like the Fugitive Slave Act and its fallout made them seem prescient instead. In the years following the Fugitive Slave Act, attempts to capture alleged fugitives from enslavement became rallying points for the anti-slavery cause. In 1851, an escaped enslaved man named Shadrach Minkins was arrested in Boston by federal marshals before being rescued by a group of black Bostonians and eventually shepherded to Canada. Several months later, a slaver named Edward Gorsuch led a posse to a farmhouse of the black Pennsylvanian William Parker near the town of Christiana. Gorsuch believed Parker was hiding a man who had recently escaped from him. A shootout ensued between Gorsuch, Parker, and their various allies, killing Gorsuch and forcing the enslavers to retreat. In 1854, another attempted extradition of a Boston fugitive, Anthony Burns, was successful, but required a guard of 150 U.S. Marines to ensure the re-enslavement of that one man. In 1858, a man named John Price was arrested as an alleged fugitive in Oberlin, Ohio. Price's captor took him as far as Wellington, 9 miles to the south, before a band of activists from Oberlin caught up with him and freed Price. Northern lawmakers also tried to craft personal liberty laws to offer legal avenues to challenge the federal Fugitive Slave Act. Although these laws varied from state to state, they usually required that basic legal procedures such as writs of habeas corpus or jury trials or standards of evidence, that these be applied to fugitive slave cases. None of this made pro-slavery white Southerners very happy at all. The Fugitive Slave Act had been a key part of the Compromise of 1850 for them, and now it seemed very much like many Northerners had no intention of enforcing it. Another major change that the Fugitive Slave Act sparked was that many black activists became far more ready to use force to defend themselves and their communities. In the early 1830s, many black activists had signed on to William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist program and his plan for moral suasion, that is, to convince slaveholders to abandon slavery as inhuman and unchristian. When the Liberator began to publish in 1831, there were few outspoken white abolitionists, and the manumissions and emancipatory laws of the early Republic were still relatively recent. Making common cause with the pacifist Garrison in hopes that more states would adopt such laws in the future seemed like a pretty good bet. But as pro-slavery forces, both North and South, responded with violence and an increasing determination to expand slavery, it seemed that not only was moral suasion not having the desired effect, but that Garrison's pacifism and rejection of electoral politics might actually be holding the movement back. By 1850, abolitionists were still a minority, but they had grown exponentially. And when the Fugitive Slave Act came along and black Americans faced an even more ever-present threat of capture and consignment to a lifetime of hard labor, many resolved to defend themselves with force if necessary. This was part of a larger split in the abolitionist movement, as in 1851, the American Anti-Slavery Society formally rejected Garrison's pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution and his refusal to engage in electoral politics. The threat of slave catchers on northern streets galvanized both black and white abolitionists to contest their principles in elections and to take up arms if attacked. As always, Frederick Douglass put it best, saying simply, quote, "The law of God required the death of kidnappers." This brings us to the presidential election of 1852, which is important because of three things. The Whigs disintegrate, the Democrats close ranks, and the Free Soilers kind of lose a step. To take these in order, the Whigs nominated Winfield Scott, another hero of the Mexican-American War. You may have noticed that both of the Whigs' presidential victories, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, were accomplished by running military heroes who had few firmly stated policy positions. Well, they tried this again, and this time it didn't work. Like in 1848, the Whigs tried to run separate campaigns in each region, promising to uphold the Compromise of 1850 in the South, while promising not to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in the North. Disgusted Free Soil-inclined Whigs abandoned the party. 9 Southern Whigs walked out of the party convention in Baltimore, confident that Northern Whigs would not stand by the compromise. Disturbingly, this group of walkouts included not only the fire-eater demagogues like Robert Toombs, but also more moderate congressmen like Alexander Stephens of Georgia. This election will mark the end of the Whigs as a major political force. These divides between their regional factions will be exacerbated by the coming Kansas-Nebraska Act, fatally weakening the party as its members jump ship for other parties that better aligned with their values. The Democrats, by contrast, closed ranks and united around the charming Franklin Pierce, a Northerner and, like Scott, a Mexican war hero. This was far from given, as competing factions of the party put forward multiple candidates, and it took 49 votes to choose a candidate at their convention. Once selected, however, Pierce was unambiguous about his belief that the Compromise of 1850 was the final settlement on slavery in the United States, and he promised to enforce every provision, including the Fugitive Slave Act. It was on Pierce's orders that the Marines descended on Boston to remand Anthony Burns to slavery. The notion of the compromise as a final settlement was appealing to Free Soil Democrats who had strayed from their party, and many rejoined the Democrats for this election. With the deserts of the Southwest unsuitable for plantation agriculture, and everything north and west of Missouri guaranteed for free settlement by the Missouri Compromise, it seemed that perhaps the crisis of slavery expansion had passed. While the Free Soil Party maintained a core of support in the Great Lakes region, defections back to the two major parties sapped their electoral strength. Their nominee, former Democrat John Hale of New Hampshire, received only half the votes that Van Buren had 4 years earlier. It was an important reminder that even as the anti-slavery movement grew, and those within its ranks became even more committed, they remained a distinct national minority. This was, of course, dispiriting for them. Joshua Giddings, an exasperated anti-slavery congressman from Ohio, lamented that, quote, "These two great parties will convert this government into a slave-holding, slave-breeding republic." When Franklin Pierce won in November 1852, Democrats interpreted their victory as a mandate from the people. Despite winning only 51% of the vote, Pierce won almost all the electoral votes. Democrats had also secured a 60% majority in the Senate and 2/3 of the House of Representatives. With the Whigs in disarray, the Democrats stood poised to pass whatever legislation they pleased. And some of the legislation they chose, arguably, I would argue, did more than any other one single thing to blow up the country. So, to recap, Uncle Tom's Cabin, released in 1852 in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, helped convince more Northerners to think critically about Southern defenses of slavery and to consider the abolitionist perspective more charitably. On the electoral front, however, things didn't look as good for the anti-slavery folks, as their Whig allies were falling apart and their Democratic allies rejoined the fold to help elect Pierce. While 6 years ago the Free Soil Party had enough congressional seats to play spoiler and threaten the two major parties, now the Democrats seem to be in firm control. Now, I know I just spent like half the episode telling you all how galvanizing the Fugitive Slave Act was and how it accelerated the conflict over slavery. Well, if the Mexican War fanned this conflict into a smoldering fire, then the Fugitive Slave Act amounted to throwing on a couple of fresh logs, then Stephen Douglas is about to come along with a big old can of Kansas, Nebraska gasoline, and the whole thing is just going to get out of control from here. So, what's the deal with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this so poorly named yet destructive piece of legislation? Well, Stephen Douglas was a senator from Illinois and a great believer in the Western expansion of the United States. He hoped not only to populate the Western territories with patriotic, God-fearing American citizens, but to build a transcontinental railroad that would tie the older eastern states to the Pacific coast. Before the Panama Canal and before any such transcontinental railroad was built, the trip to California was long and arduous, whether one went over land or by sea around Cape Horn. Douglas hoped that the emerging city of Chicago in his home state might serve as the eastern terminus of this railroad, making the railroad not only a boon for the country, but for Douglas's constituents as well. As chairman of the Senate Committee on the Territories, Douglas was poised to make this happen. There was a difficulty, however. Most Southern lawmakers had no interest in organizing the Western territories which Douglas's proposed railroad would have to pass through because, as I just mentioned, thanks to the Missouri Compromise, any state carved out of the territories north of Missouri would be free states. Not one to be dismayed, Douglas wrote a bill that would carve two new territories out of the Louisiana Purchase, Kansas and Nebraska. And crucially, both would be settled based on the ambiguous doctrine of popular sovereignty. The people of those territories would, somehow, be allowed to decide for themselves whether to permit or forbid slavery. The idea was that Kansas, adjacent to Missouri, would hopefully be a slave state, while Nebraska to the north would balance the scales as a free state. Now, Douglas thought this was a swell idea. Popular sovereignty seemed like the perfect solution to the sticky problem of slavery in the territories because the whole, let the people choose aspect gave it a nice democratic veneer, and most importantly, it took the whole question out of Congress. Douglas and his allies believed popular sovereignty's ambiguity, the question of when and how the decision over slavery in an individual territory would be made, This ambiguity would allow popular sovereignty to be popular with Americans both North and South. But this was not enough for some of the ardently pro-slavery congressmen, however. 4 Southern bigwig senators, known as the F Street Mess after the boarding house they shared, demanded further concessions. Douglas cut a deal with these guys such that the proposed bill would include a provision repealing the Missouri Compromise entirely. If the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law, the entire remaining Louisiana Purchase, guaranteed for a generation to be free territory, would suddenly be open to slavery. Northern Democrats were divided on the bill. Some saw the Missouri Compromise as a sort of sacred compact, a guarantee that should not be overturned just to satisfy political convenience. This was a popular stance in the North. Remember, if you were 50 years old at this time, the Missouri Compromise would have been established for your entire adult life. It was seen by many as equivalent to the compromises over slavery that were in the Constitution itself. Many other Democrats, however, did not have a problem. Some of them were pro-slavery, sure, but even the ones that wanted to keep the West free figured that the climate would make it unlikely that slavery would thrive there, and that the more populous North would send more settlers and outnumber Southerners anyway. And so ultimately, slavery wouldn't thrive in the West. If the hardcore pro-slavery guys cared so much about the possibility of slavery, then fine, let them have it. See how much good it does them. These guys just didn't really think they were giving up anything. Many Northern Whigs, and especially Free Soilers, were unwilling to take this chance, however. They argued that Congress had a right, a duty to bar slavery from the territories. They argued that the Founding Fathers had never intended slavery to spread throughout the country, and that was why slavery was a state, not a national institution. They argued that the Missouri Compromise was settled law, that it should not be overturned and upset decades of precedent. Ohioans Salmon Chase and Joshua Giddings collaborated on an excellent political pamphlet laying much of this out, arguing that the slave power conspiracy was endangering the country, corrupting the ideals and intentions of the founding generation, and that Americans must, quote, defend free territory against the encroachments of slavery, unquote. Importantly, the Kansas-Nebraska debate offered anti-slavery men like Chase and Giddings, who were often decried by their enemies as dangerous radicals, a chance to portray themselves instead as conservative defenders of the status quo. Douglas's pro-slavery backers wanted none of this, of course, and made a number of arguments of their own. They called Northerners hypocrites for supporting the Wilmot Proviso, which would have barred slavery south of the Missouri Compromise line. But now they cried foul when Southerners tried to establish slavery north of it. They claimed that Northerners never truly intended to respect the Missouri line, that this was just a convenient excuse, and really all this was about was abolitionism and attacking the South. They invoked Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Seneca Falls Convention as symbols of an alleged Northern radicalism. Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, one of the F Street Mess guys, drew these points together in a speech in which he denounced the meddlesome Northerners, claiming their abolitionism and quote-unquote strong-minded womanism would, quote, result in sectional alienation, civil strife, and perhaps servile insurrection, unquote. Men like Butler interpreted abolitionism and early feminism as the leading edge of a cavalcade of dangerous, radical, foreign innovations that the North was recklessly experimenting with, further evidence that they were untrustworthy folk. In the end, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. Possibly no other single event in the lead-up of the Civil War did more to convince the common citizens of the northern United States that their southern brethren were a threat to the country. Why was this? Well, part of it has to do with the violence that breaks out in Kansas as a result of this, but I'm saving that for next episode. For now, I want to talk about what the law itself meant. Like I've said before, most Northerners were not abolitionists. Many were anti-slavery in the sense that they didn't want to live in a slave state, would not want slavery introduced in their state, and harbored prejudice against Black Americans generally. Many were self-described conservatives and valued this label. America had its revolution. It had secured rights and freedoms that liberals throughout Europe still hoped for in vain. Their duty, as one of the first post-revolutionary generations, was to conserve the gains that had been made on behalf of the freedom of the people. They looked to countries like France across the Atlantic and Gran Colombia over the Gulf, and saw Republican states either splinter and splinter again, fail in the face of resurgent monarchy, or radicalize and immolate themselves in an orgy of factional conflict. They idealized their American Union as something different, better, a firm example that self-government need not mean kneeling to the fickle whims of mobs, but that it could be executed by sober, reasonable men. To people like this, all the agitation over slavery seemed like dangerous radicalism that ought to be tamped down and shut up. So how did they become anti-slavery voters that would eventually help bring the Republicans to power? Kansas, Nebraska was a slap in the face. In one fell swoop, a law that had governed some of the country's most important national resources, the territories that were its very future, it was swept aside. Also, the pro-slavery fanatics could have a better chance at even more wealth, even more slaves. What was the point of trying to negotiate with these Southerners anyway? If they would so casually sweep aside this decades-old agreement, what assurance was there that they would stick by the next compromise? The Southerners had gotten Missouri as a slave state. They got their gag rule in Congress. They got their massive chunk of Mexican land, and they got their new improved fugitive slave law. Now they had to lay their hands on northern states' future territories? What madness was this? What more could they possibly want? In the pages of northern newspapers, former pro-compromise men became rapid converts to the belief in the aggressive slave power conspiracy. One self-described quote-unquote conservative old Whig denounced the slave power as a quote aristocracy which has planted its foot upon our necks. The Boston Daily Atlas, which had defended the Compromise of 1850, now warned its readers of the threat that the slave power represented. Quote, "We find in the nation a power which little by little has aggrandized itself until it has become a despotism. It mobs and shoots, tars and feathers, hangs and rips open mailbags, imprisons travelers, bullies Congress, and debauches the courts. It is a power which sweeps away the serenity of law and order and substitutes in its place brawling anarchy and sanguinary semi-civilization." Unquote. Referring to the Missouri Compromise line, which had stood for a generation as the barrier between freedom and slavery, the Atlas asked, was it better, quote, to seek to rebuild that shattered barrier against the black and bloody sea of savagery, or to hang one's head, fold one's hands, and wait with submission for their own destruction? Clearly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act touched a nerve. As I said, for many Northerners, the Missouri Compromise was akin to the constitutional compromises over slavery. That pro-slavery advocates would sweep it away so rashly was a sure sign that such people had no intention of negotiating in good faith, and that perhaps those anti-slavery fanatics had been right when they warned that the slave power was ever hungry, aggressive, and voracious. Now, we don't have opinion polls from the 19th century. I can't give you a solid number on the approval rating of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the northern states. But sometimes we get fortunate, and we get something that we can use instead. See, the Kansas-Nebraska Act went into effect on May 30th, 1854. And 5 months later, every congressman who had voted for it was up for re-election. And man, oh man, did the Northern Democrats take a beating. Almost every Democratic congressman from a northern state who voted for the act either resigned or lost their re-election bid. The number of Northern Democrats in the House declined over 70%. It was, to put it bluntly, a political bloodbath. Northerners were not fond of that law. So, to summarize, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was an incredibly unpopular piece of legislation in the northern states. It felt to many Northerners that Southerners had rejected compromise and equality. The Southern senators of the F Street mess clearly overplayed their hand by pushing for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, as this was what angered Northerners the most and led them to reject the Democrats at the polls. I would argue that these 4 years in which Northerners reject a key element of the Compromise of 1850 and Southerners achieve the repeal of the Missouri Compromise is crucial to explaining why there will be no more compromises. In each region, those who had said you can't trust the other guys had now seemingly been proven right. This is getting a bit ahead of ourselves, though, because in the months between the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the 1854 midterm elections, some opponents of the act started to try to coordinate a new party. These were free soilers who had supported Van Buren in 1848, as well as new defectors from the fracturing Whigs and defeated Democrats outraged over the travesty that was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These organizations first began to gain ground in the Great Lakes region, in Michigan and Wisconsin, and they soon dubbed themselves the Republicans. These guys were, in the words of one eminent historian, a crazy quilt coalition. You had businessmen and merchants of major commercial centers and industrial areas who wanted to preserve what had been the status quo and prevent further conflict over slavery. You had working-class folks, farmers, craftsmen, and wage workers who believed that only a free West could provide upward mobility. And you had the anti-slavery reformers, the activists and abolitionists who had been organizing around electing anti-slavery candidates for 15 years in some cases, and now saw an excellent chance to bring new allies into the fold. What held this conglomeration of diverse people and interests together was their antipathy to the growing slave power. All shared a belief that slaveholders had grown too strong, and if their aggression was left unchecked, the future they hoped for would be ruined. They all shared a hatred of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and wanted to prevent the extension of slavery. Now, what else they could all agree on remained to be determined. The Republicans did not have a huge immediate influence, however, because while they grew rapidly in the upper Midwest, in states like New York and Pennsylvania and even Illinois, another new party was profiting even more from the demise of the Whigs. This was the American Party, a movement that tapped into multiple long-running strains of American anxiety to win surprise victories in the 1854 elections. Part of the reason this came as a surprise was because the party initially acted as a sort of secretive fraternal order, recruiting new members by word of mouth and instructing inductees to answer that they, quote-unquote, know nothing about the American Party if asked. Consequently, they are generally known as the know-nothings, both because that's what their rivals called them, and because calling them Americans would get very confusing. As I said, the know-nothings capitalized on several entrenched American fears. They ran on opposition to immigration, Catholicism, and just the political establishment in general. Why these particular issues, you might wonder? Well, I haven't mentioned it before because we had a lot of other stuff going on, and also because I was saving it for now, but the United States was experiencing the most immigration it had ever, indeed, by some measures, has ever experienced. 1.7 million people emigrated to the United States in the 1840s, nearly 3 times as many as in the 1830s. By the end of the 1850s, 2.6 million more had landed on American shores. While the U.S. has experienced times when more total immigrants arrived, this is the largest wave of immigration ever relative to the existing U.S. population. Throughout this period, immigrants made up between 10 and 15% of the U.S. population, and much more in major northern cities where they frequently arrived. Where were all these arrivals coming from, you might ask? Well, Ireland and Germany were by far the largest contributors. The Great Famine in Ireland, commonly known as the Irish Potato Famine, had begun in 1845, and over the next 5 years, nearly 1 million Irish left their homeland for the United States. Major U.S. cities such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia soon had a significant Irish minority. The causes of German migration were more diverse. Some fled the 1848 revolutions, either because they were disappointed revolutionaries or simply escaping the upheaval. Many others chose to emigrate more deliberately, however, gambling on the opportunity for prosperity and advancement in the United States, and establishing farms and businesses throughout the Midwest, and forming enclaves in cities like Cincinnati and St. Louis. As you may have gathered, most of this emigration occurred in the northern states, as immigrants sought more abundant work in northern cities, or to establish new communities where wealthy planters did not already dominate the most productive land. So, when the Know-Nothings talked about immigration, they were discussing a real issue. The demographics of the United States were changing, quickly and drastically. The Know-Nothings' reaction to this, however, was draconian and prejudiced. They proposed extending the minimum residency for naturalization as a citizen from 5 to 21 years. They proposed restricting office holding to American-born citizens. And they teamed up with evangelical reformers to enact alcohol bans, drinking being a vice they associated with the Irish and German immigrants. These urban immigrants were a key component of the Democrats' voter base in the North, and so Know-Nothings also channeled their opposition to immigration into a critique of the party establishment. The Democrats, they argued, who had doomed the country with their Kansas-Nebraska Act, were not a democratic party at all. They gained power based on fraudulent immigrant votes and the Three-Fifths Compromise. No wonder they were so out of touch. They did not represent the people at all. And of course, by the people, Know-Nothings meant white Protestant non-immigrants. To cap it all off, the fact that some of the newly arrived Germans and virtually all of the Irish were Catholic allowed the Know-Nothings to tap into Protestant Americans' long-standing distrust of Roman Catholicism. Although many Northern Know-Nothings were anti-slavery, and like the Republicans supported repealing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they argued that the conspiracy that threatened America was less the slave power, but more the threat of the Pope's minions. These Irish and German immigrants were a fifth column, they declared, sent to corrupt the United States from within and convert it, using their own Republican elections from a land of Protestant liberty to just another backwards Catholic province under papal domination. The Know-Nothings were less popular in the southern states, where there were fewer urban areas and fewer immigrants, but the party did gain popularity in cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, and New Orleans. Notably, while white Southerners had fewer real immigrants in the mix, Southerner Know-Nothings used immigration as a sort of proxy issue to air their anxiety about what they perceived as Northern radicalism. Southerners who were drawn to the Know-Nothing Party were repulsed by what they saw as growing urban political mobs in the North, giving those states the population and therefore the political power to dominate the South. They also feared the Southern Democrats, who more and more invoked threats of disunion, threatening to blow up the Union if they didn't receive the concessions they wanted. For some Southerners, then, the Know-Nothing Party, without the anti-slavery bent it had in the North, of course, was a way to express unionism at a time when it seemed like both their Southern Democrat neighbors and their Northern countrymen were courting disaster. For some Southerners, then, the Know-Nothing Party, without the anti-slavery bent that it had in the North, of course, it was a way to express unionism at a time when it seemed that both their Southern Democrat neighbors and their Northern countrymen were courting disaster. In Virginia, for instance, to be a Know-Nothing required swearing an oath never to vote for anyone who advocated disunion. Although the Know-Nothings surprised nearly everyone with their performance in the 1854 election, within 2 years they were eclipsed on the national stage by the Republicans. Two major factors led to their rapid demise. First, their own success in 1854 helped convince many longtime Whigs who had yet to jump ship that the Whig Party was over. And many of these Whigs who had been hanging on, men like Abraham Lincoln, who considered themselves loyal Whigs for their whole lives, well, now they felt free to find a new political home, and most of those guys migrated to the Republicans' broad coalition. Second, as we'll talk about next week, the fallout from the Kansas-Nebraska Act continued in the form of armed violence on the plains of Kansas. Attacks by pro-slavery guerrilla bands in eastern Kansas did a lot to convince northern voters that between the alleged papal conspiracy decried by the Know-Nothings and the slave power conspiracy decried by the Republicans, the slave power might be the greater threat. So why talk about the Know-Nothings then? Well, first, because they're a reminder that history is not neat and tidy. The Republicans didn't rise immediately from the ashes of the Whigs to take their place as the next member of the two-party political system. The Know-Nothings were a sort of interregnum that could have been a dynasty if the Republicans had been less capable and the Know-Nothings perhaps a bit more adaptable. But more importantly, I think they illustrate important elements of the American political culture in the last years before this sectional crisis really breaks out into war. On the Southern side, we were reminded that although the pro-slavery radicals among the Democrats made a lot of noise, there were plenty of folks who remained committed Unionists and viewed both Northern abolitionists and pro-slavery fire-eater demagogues as threats to law and order. Away from the Deep South, where enslaved people approached half the population, firebrand rhetoric from men like Robert Toombs seemed provocative and dangerous. Several slave states will ultimately decline to secede, and the consistent pull of unionism expressed here in the Know-Nothings is a significant reason why. On the northern side, the Know-Nothings' own conspiratorial explanation of politics, in parallel with the slave power conspiracy that we discussed at the beginning of this episode, this shows us some of the deep-seated anxieties in northern political culture. These conspiracies shared a fear and distrust that some autocratic power, be it the Pope or the slaveholder aristocrat, was corrupting the American political system to establish their dominance over the United States and turn the Union from its providential purpose as a land consecrated to the freedom of white men. The fact that both parties rode very similar conspiratorial rhetoric to power is a strong indication that these lines of thinking had a powerful hold over American voters. This conceptual framework helped guide Northern responses to the unfolding crisis, including, as we'll talk about next episode, the first outbreak of sustained violence in Kansas. American Ambition is written and performed by me, Stefan Lund, and edited and produced by Luke Vancleave. Our theme music is also by Luke. Thank you for listening, and join us on our next episode when we will discuss the conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, the infamous Dred Scott Supreme Court case, and the revolutionary plans of one Mr. John Brown.